I was the only one on the platform that morning who still knew how to read the vault line by ear. That's not a boast, it's just the job. 31 years I'd worked the dead spur above Sallow Key. First as a proper dispatcher when the line still carried freight down from the engineer settlements. Then, after the upper junctions collapsed and the company pulled out, as whatever I was now. Dockmaster, the town called it. Market warden. I sold berths to the fish carts and kept the gulls off the drying racks, and once or twice a year, I climbed the old iron stair to grease a switch. Nobody but me remembered how to throw. The vault line hadn't run a scheduled car in 11 years. It still talked to me, though, the way an old dog does. A click in its sleep, a groan in the rail when the tide came in wrong. I was the only one left who spoke that language, because I was the only one who'd stayed to listen. That's why I heard it before I saw it. A sound the line had never made in my hearing, not the tired creak of expansion, but a rising hum, high and even, climbing through the trestle legs like something alive. I put down the crate I was carrying and looked up the spur toward the dead junction 3 miles off, where the rail bent out of sight behind the ridge, and for one long breath I told myself it was wind in the ironwork. Then the light came around the bend, and it was moving faster than anything had ever moved on that line, faster than anything should move on any line built by hands, and it was coming straight for the frozen switch points at the harbor bend that hadn't been thrown in a decade. I ran. I want to say I thought it through, weighed the risk, made a decision. I didn't. My legs went before my head did, up the rusted stair 2 rungs at a time, because some part of me that was still a dispatcher after all these years knew exactly what was about to happen if those points stayed set the way they'd been left in the last true winter of the line's working life. A car coming in that hot, hitting a switch locked for a siding that didn't connect to anything but a drop into the tide flats. It wouldn't derail so much as it would simply stop existing, and whatever was inside it with it. The lever hadn't turned in 11 years. It fought me. I put my whole back into it and felt something in my shoulder tear a little, and it gave all at once, groaning over, and the rail beneath it sang a new note as the points locked home onto the through line instead. The only through line left, the one that ran clean out along the seawall and lost its speed gradually against the long uphill grade before the old passenger stub. The car went by underneath me so fast the platform boards hummed through my boots. I didn't get a clean look. Gray, low, no markings I recognized, no driver's cage that I could see. It was already 300 yards off and slowing, the grade doing what I'd hoped. By the time I got back down the stair and started walking toward wherever it finally lost its nerve and stopped. It had come to rest against the old buffer stop at the passenger stub, canted a little where one wheel truck had finally given up gripping the rail. Steam or something like it rose off the undercarriage in thin white ropes. I stood there a moment before I went any closer, because 31 years on that line had taught me that the things which arrive without warning are rarely simple, and simple was not a word I'd have reached for watching that car come around the bend. The hatch on the near side was already open, hanging loose on one hinge like something had forced it from inside rather than outside. I climbed up and looked in, and that was when I stopped being a dockmaster and started being whatever it is I've been ever since. There was a girl inside, small, smaller than the seat she was folded into, knees drawn up against her chest, one arm flung out toward the control housing like she'd been reaching for something even as she went under. Her skin was the gray blue of deep water and shadow, and beneath it, faint as a heartbeat you can see rather than hear, ran a lattice of paler veins that pulsed slow and even along her throat and the backs of her hands. Her hands were the worst of it, both of them scorched black across the palms, the way a rope burns a grip that's held too hard for too long. She was breathing. That was the only fact I let myself need in that moment. I carried her down myself rather than wait for help I wasn't sure would come fast enough, and I laid her out in the back room of the harbor office on a cot I hadn't used since my own knees went bad enough to need somewhere to nap between tides. She didn't wake for the better part of a day. When she did, it was with a small, controlled intake of breath and no scream at all, which told me something about what she'd already learned to do with fear before I ever met her. She wouldn't tell me her name that first day, or the second. She watched me instead, the way you'd watch weather you didn't trust yet, and I let her, because I understood that watching was the only power she had left to spend. What she did tell me, eventually, in fragments dropped sideways rather than handed over whole, was Wind Hollow Cut, a settlement 300 miles up the dead network, built by engineers 2 generations back into a fold of the ridge where the old vault still held whatever it was the vanished builders had sealed there. And she told me, without ever quite saying the word for it, what had happened to Wind Hollow Cut 11 days before she came through my switch at a speed the line was never built to survive. There is a crew that works the derelict spurs looking for children like her. Line sense, her people call the trait, a body that reads the old rail network the way ours reads a held breath, A pulse that answers the dead rhythms in the rail the way a tuning fork answers its twin. It isn't magic. It's blood and inheritance, nothing stranger than that, and it is exactly the kind of ordinary miracle that men with a ledger and no conscience will pay well for. Because a child with line sense can open a sealed vault door that has turned away every drill and every charge for 40 years. The crew that came to Wind Hollow Cut called themselves the Tallyman's Outfit, and they didn't come to trade. They came to take, and to burn what they couldn't carry, and she'd escaped the only way a 9-year-old girl escapes a burning settlement built on a dead rail spur. She'd gotten aboard the one working car left in the yard, put her scorched hands against a control housing that answered to her blood the way it never would to mine, and asked it to go as fast as it had ever gone in its working life, toward anywhere that wasn't there anymore. I didn't ask her name a third time. I told her mine instead, and the fourth morning she gave me hers in return. Quiet, like setting down something heavy she'd been carrying only to test whether my hands were steady enough to take it. Cyril. I didn't make a ceremony of it. I just said it back to her, once, and went on frying the morning fish the way I had every morning for 31 years, and something in her shoulders came down half an inch that hadn't been down since I pulled her out of that car. We built what we had in small, unspoken competencies rather than words, which suited us both. She learned the market's rhythms faster than any child I'd ever watched learn anything. Which card opened first, which gull was a thief and which was only loud, how the tide changed the smell of the flats an hour before it changed the color of the water. I learned to read her the way I'd once read the line, not by what she said, but by the pulse under her skin, which brightened and steadied when she was easy, and drew tight and pale when something in the yard put her back in that burning settlement without meaning to. I never touched the burned wire spool she kept, or the small brass control key she'd carried off that car and wouldn't set down even to sleep. I understood by then that they weren't keepsakes. They were proof, to herself, that she'd done the thing that got her out, and a person is entitled to keep whatever proves that to themselves. It was the 9th day when the first ripple of trouble reached the quay. A trader come down from the ridge roads mentioned, over nothing more than the price of saltfish, that there were men 2 towns back asking after a runaway car, and a girl who might have come off it, offering good coin for word of where either had landed. I didn't react in front of him. I've spent 30 years not reacting in front of people, and it's a harder skill than most give it credit for. But I went straight to the harbor ledger after he left, the manifest book where every unusual arrival at Sallow Quay gets logged by law, in case the company ever comes back to ask what became of its dead line's last cargo. There was an entry, 3 lines long, made by the young clerk who helps me on market days. A runaway car, origin unknown, 1 passenger, condition and disposition to be confirmed, true in every particular. I read it twice, and then I took it to the stove and burned it, page and all, and told the clerk the next morning that the entry had been an error. A car with no passenger after all. Please strike it from his memory along with the book. He didn't argue. He was young enough to think I was simply an old man protecting his pride over a clerical slip. I let him think that. It cost me nothing, and it cost the truth everything it needed to survive. They came 4 days after that, on a gray morning with the tide running out and the market barely opened. 3 of them, dressed like traders but moving like men who'd never once in their lives had to actually sell anything, and I knew them before they'd said a word, the way you know a storm front by the particular color the sky goes wrong. The one who spoke for them was soft-voiced, almost kind about it, which told me he was the most dangerous of the 3. He said they were looking for a girl who'd come off a wrecked car some days back, said there was a fair sum in it for anyone who could point them toward her, said the girl herself wasn't in any trouble. They only wanted to bring her home to people who missed her. I let him finish. I've learned that letting a man finish his lie costs you nothing, and shows you exactly how far he's willing to walk it. Then I told him there'd been no girl. A car, yes, wrecked and empty, salvaged for scrap 2 weeks back. I watched his eyes go to the harbor office behind me, to the shuttered window of the back room, and I understood he already knew I was lying, and that the coin he'd mentioned was about to become a threat instead, the way it always does with men like that once the soft approach fails to buy what they came for. He named a price. It was more money than I'd see in 3 years of market tolls. I told him the same answer, plain, unchanged, and watched the kindness go out of his face like a lamp turned down. What happened next? I won't dress up as more than it was. He put a hand toward the office door and I put myself between him and it, and one of the others reached for me. And I am an old man, but I am an old man who has spent 31 years hauling switch levers that haven't moved in a decade, and my hands still remember how to hold a line under strain. It wasn't a fight worth telling twice. It was long enough for the shout I gave to carry to the harbor tower, where the boy who runs the signal flag for incoming boats had, without my ever asking him to, learned enough of my old trade over the years to know what 3 long pulls on that flag rope meant. He threw the one lever on that whole dead spur that's still connected to something. The old passenger stub where Sorrel's car had come to rest, routing it, for the first time in 11 years, onto the seawall run at full open, no buffer, straight out along the harbor's edge where the drop to the tide flats waited. It wasn't a weapon. I want that understood plainly. It was a door, opened onto a fall those men would have to choose whether or not to walk into, and men who trade in threats rather than convictions do not, in my long experience, care to bet their own lives on a line they don't understand, and I do. The soft-voiced one looked at where that rail now ran, looked at me, and understood I'd meant to show him exactly how much of that dead line still belonged to nobody but me. He called his men back. He told me, without any kindness left in it at all, that the coin didn't run out, and neither did his patience, and that Salo-Kui was a small port with a long memory for men who make enemies of the wrong outfits. I told him my memory was longer than his patience would ever need to be, and that he should test it somewhere else. They left on the evening tide. I don't know if they'll come back, and I've stopped pretending to myself that they won't. But I know they left with less than they came for, and that the girl in my back room slept that whole night with her pulse steady under her skin for the first time since I'd pulled her from that car, because she'd watched through the shutter slats and seen, for the first time in 11 days, someone stand his ground on her behalf and not bend. I didn't tell her, in the days after, that I'd thought about keeping her. I won't pretend the thought never crossed me. An old man alone above a dead line, and a girl who'd already learned my market better than I had some seasons of it myself. But I'd heard her say Wind Hollow Cut in her sleep more than once, in the particular voice a person uses for a name they're afraid has stopped meaning anything, and I understood that keeping her quiet and safe with me would only be another kind of burial, gentler than the tallyman's but a burial all the same. So I did the one useful thing 31 years on a dead line had actually prepared me for. I went through what was left of the company's old freight manifests, back to a season before the upper junctions failed, and I found what I was looking for. A transfer record for surviving kin of Wind Hollow Cut families, relocated after an earlier collapse to a sister settlement 200 miles down the coast road, a place called Rill's End that still had a working spur of its own. I didn't tell her what I'd found until I was certain of it. I've watched enough hope offered carelessly to know it does more damage unconfirmed than silence ever could. I walked her down the coast road myself. It took the better part of 5 days, and I won't say either of us talked much of what waited at the end of it, because there are some hopes too large to carry in conversation without dropping them. But on the last morning, coming down into Rill's End with the tide just turning, she stopped walking entirely, and I followed where she was looking, and there was a woman on that platform, with the same gray-blue skin, and the same pale lattice under it, standing very still the way people stand when they've stopped believing a particular grief will ever end, and haven't yet let themselves hope it might. I didn't need to ask if it was her aunt. The pulse under Cyril's skin answered before either of them said a word, brightened, all at once, the way I'd only ever seen it do once before, the first morning she said my name back to me. I gave her the wire spool myself before she ran that last 100 yards, because I understood by then it was never mine to keep, and never really hers either. It belonged to Wind Hollow Cut, to the door she'd forced open with her own scorched hands to get out alive, and it belonged now at Rill's End with the people who'd carry what was left of that place forward. The brass key she kept. Some things a person is owed the right to hold on to, whatever they end up meaning later. I walked back to Salo-Kui alone, 5 days the other direction, and the deadline talked to me the whole way in its usual small tired language, click and groan and the settle of iron cooling in the evening. It had one new thing to say now though, low under all the old ones, that once, exactly once in 31 years of listening, it had spoken faster and louder than I'd ever thought it capable of, and I had been standing on the platform, the only one who still knew how to answer. I still work the dawn market. I still climb the stair twice a year to grease a switch nobody else remembers, but I keep that lever oiled a little better now than the law requires, in case the line ever decides to speak that fast again, and in case whoever it's carrying needs someone standing on the platform who already knows how to listen.